Washington erupts into a battlefield as 19-year-old Barron Trump hauls Jasmine Crockett into court. But one witness detonates the trial with a 9-second revelation, exposing a hidden campaign that flips the nation upside down. The scandal rockets from defamation to a fight for America's soul. What explosive truth in those 9 seconds shattered an entire dynasty? Stay with us, this is a story worth every second of your time. Washington, D.C., 2025. The city was boiling with distrust and elections spiraling out of control scandals every day, and a nation split in half. The courthouse doors swung open and the room erupted with flashing cameras. Every click hit like gunfire. This was no ordinary hearing. This was a trial where truth and power would collide. Barron Trump, just 19, entered first. Tall, arrogant, but hiding nerves behind a rigid jaw. His lawyers fanned out beside him, carrying thick files. The case, a defamation lawsuit against Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Barron claims she smeared his name on live television by accusing him of secretly using the Trump legacy to twist politics. To him, it was about honor. To her, it was about silencing. Then Jasmine Crockett arrived. No spectacle, just one black folder in her hand. Her eyes cut like blades. She whispered, "One witness, 9 seconds, that's all it takes to bring their dynasty down." The doors of the courtroom had barely shut when the hush fell, a heavy silence that made every cough and shuffle echo like thunder. Outside, Washington was boiling with chaos, but inside all eyes were fixed on the front, where Barron Trump and his team sat poised for battle. His lead attorney, Richard Halpern, a seasoned litigator with silver hair and a voice sharp as a blade, rose slowly. He carried a binder thick with documents, the kind that looked heavy enough to crush an opponent before a single word was spoken. Cameras from every angle zoomed in, hungry for the opening strike. Halpern's voice cut through the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court, my client, Barron William Trump, a 19-year-old young man with no political office, no campaign, and no public power, has been viciously defamed. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett chose to go on national television and paint him as a manipulator of politics. She accused him of trading on his family name to influence policy. This is not spirited debate. This is targeted destruction of a boy who has never sought to enter her world. We are here today because reputation matters. Honor matters." His words echoed, each syllable designed to sculpt Barron into the image of an innocent lamb thrown into a wolf's den. As Halpern continued, he gestured toward his client. Barron sat tall, chin slightly raised, his expression carefully trained to look wounded rather than arrogant. Halpern pressed the point again. "What we see here is not politics as usual. This is a blood sport. A powerful congresswoman decided to make Barron Trump her target to score headlines by dragging his name through the mud. My client is not a politician. He is a student, a son, a young man entitled to the same protections as any citizen. Yet he has been branded a villain for no reason other than his last name. The framing was clear: Barron, the victim; Crockett, the predator. The narrative Halpern was spinning was amplified almost instantly outside the courtroom. Conservative media outlets flooded the airwaves with carefully edited clips of Jasmine Crockett. The clips were short, sharp, and damning. Her voice raised, her finger jabbing in past hearings, moments cut to look like outbursts. On television screens, she was painted as the angry politician, a lawmaker incapable of restraint. The Chiron on one channel read, "Crockett loses control again." Social media picked up the thread, mocking her tone, sharing memes of her shouting, with captions like "unstable" and "obsessed." The smear machine was in full swing. Within hours, the tide of public opinion shifted. On Twitter, hashtags like "Stand with Barron" trended worldwide. Commentators on talk shows shook their heads, repeating the same line. How could a powerful congresswoman attack a 19-year-old inside the courtroom? The effect was visible. Jurors leaned forward, their eyes flickering with sympathy toward Barron. Even some reporters scribbled notes with skepticism aimed at Crockett. The young Trump, at least for the moment, wore the mask of a victim perfectly. The balance had tilted. Then came the moment that pierced the haze. Jasmine Crockett stood. She was deliberate, unhurried, her chair scraping the floor as the sound sliced through the room. She looked directly at the judge, then at Halpern, then at Barron. Her voice was steady, low, but resonant, carrying the weight of conviction. This is not just a personal lawsuit. This is not about a boy whose feelings were hurt. This is about how a dynasty uses the law to silence the truth. If I bow my head today, then tomorrow any one of you sitting in this chamber could be the next victim, and I will not be the example of surrender." The words hit like a hammer. A murmur rippled across the courtroom. Reporters sat up straighter. The cameras leaned closer. In a single breath, Crockett had flipped the frame no longer. The attacker, she cast herself as the defender of principle, the shield for every citizen threatened by unchecked power. The jury's eyes shifted back to her, some now wary, some conflicted. And then, as if she had rehearsed for this exact beat, Crockett added fuel that set the press aflame. "And let me be clear," she said, her eyes narrowing toward Barron, "this lawsuit does not exist in a vacuum. There is a strategy behind it, a coordinated effort to bury dissent, to control the narrative, to punish anyone who dares to speak truth to power." Her tone sharpened, slicing the air. She did not say the words campaign or operation, but the implication was unmistakable. This was no simple case of defamation. It was a political weapon. The reaction was immediate. Pens flew across notepads. One reporter muttered, "She's hinting at something bigger." The press gallery lit up with the glow of phones as headlines were typed out in real time. Crockett suggests Trump family plot. Is this lawsuit part of a dirty campaign? What Halpern had built carefully with legal arguments began to tremble under the weight of suspicion. The courtroom had transformed. A moment ago, Barron was the innocent boy under siege, the narrative reinforced by Halpern's booming rhetoric and the media's selective cuts. Now doubt crept in, dark and invasive. Crockett had cracked the surface. She had not revealed evidence, not yet, but she had planted the seed of a conspiracy, a seed that promised to grow into headlines, investigations, and relentless public scrutiny. The battle lines were no longer clear. This was not just about one statement on television. This was about the suggestion of a hidden machine, a dirty war fought in the shadows, with lawsuits and media spin as weapons. The trial had shifted and everyone in that room knew it, and the shift was only beginning. The courtroom fireworks spilled out into the streets, and the media devoured it whole. Every channel ran nonstop coverage, split screens showing Barron on one side and Crockett on the other, anchors barking opinions like referees in a fight. Supporters of the Trump family called Crockett a reckless radical. Her backers hit back just as hard, accusing Barron of playing the victim while wielding his last name as a weapon. Cable news debates turned into shouting matches, hashtags clashed online, and the country seemed to split in half over a trial barely 2 days old. Inside the storm, Barron retreated to his hotel suite. The curtains were drawn, the lights dim, but the pressure didn't ease. His father's voice came down like a hammer. "This is not just your problem, Barron. This is the family's fight. You carry the Trump name. You don't get to falter." The advisors echoed the same line, drilling into him that the case was about empire, not youth. Barron stared at the floor, a question gnawing at him. Was he really making choices, or was he just another chess piece moved by invisible hands? Across town, Jasmine Crockett sat in her office, her phone buzzing nonstop with anonymous threats. "Drop the case or pay the price," one text read. Another warned her family would be dragged into the fire. Friends urged her to walk away to spare herself, but she laughed short and sharp. "If I back down now," she told them, "they'll just find the next person to destroy." Her defiance was calm, but the danger was real and everyone knew it. Then came the leak that raised the stakes. A whisper spread through the press. A key witness was preparing to leave the United States in 72 hours. If he slipped away, critical evidence might vanish forever. Suddenly, the trial was no longer just about arguments in court. It was a ticking clock. The audience could feel it, a bomb, primed to go off, each second tightening the noose of suspense. Day one ended in fire, but day two promised an inferno. The courtroom was filled to capacity, reporters, shoulder-to-shoulder cameras, ready to capture the next blow. When Jasmine Crockett's lead attorney, Marcia Tillman, rose from her seat, the energy shifted. She held a thin folder, not the mountain of paper Richard Halpern had brandished the day before. The confidence in her stride drew every eye. She opened the folder, lifted a single sheet, and announced, "We have an internal email, one that shows a deliberate plan to destroy my client's reputation through orchestrated media manipulation." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Tillman stepped closer to the bench and unfolded the page. Her voice was sharp, clear, leaving no room for doubt. "This email is from a private communications thread involving multiple media consultants connected to the Trump family. It is dated 3 weeks before Congresswoman Crockett's televised comments. She paused, then began to read aloud. The strategy is to frame her as unstable, push clips where she's raising her voice, amplify her temper, use influencers to call her unhinged, obsessed, and dangerous. Hashtag ideas Crockett, unstable Crockett, out of control. Goals: saturate the feeds within 48 hours after her next appearance. The room erupted. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Barron stiffened in his chair, color draining from his face. Halpern bolted upright. Objection, he barked. This so-called evidence is unauthenticated. Anyone can draft an email. This is nothing but fabrication. His words came fast, sharp, desperate to plug the wound before it bled further. The judge raised a hand, signaling for order, but the fire was already loose. Crockett's team held firm. Tillman spoke again, her tone steady, drilling into the silence. This is not rumor. This is not guesswork. This is a documented plan to weaponize perception. And the target was my client. She turned to the jury, letting the words sink in. They weren't content to argue facts. They plotted to brand her unfit to poison the well of public opinion before she ever walked into this room. Cameras clicked in a frenzy. Half the press gallery rushed out the doors to file breaking news alerts. Outside phones lit up with headlines: secret email surfaces in Trump vs. Crockett trial. On social media, hashtags began trending within minutes. Screens across the nation filled with screenshots of the email. Millions shared it, debated it, tore it apart line by line. The court wasn't just hearing evidence, it was watching a live detonation. Barron shifted uncomfortably, whispering to Halpern, who leaned in, his jaw tight. "We can't let this stand," the lawyer hissed under his breath. Barron's eyes darted to the cameras, catching their relentless focus. He looked less like the wrong boy Halpern had painted, and more like someone cornered, his composure cracking. The jurors noticed. The reporters noticed. The balance of sympathy was no longer guaranteed. The judge called for order again, banging the gavel, but the atmosphere had already transformed. What had begun as Barron's quest to clear his name was now dripping with suspicion. If such a coordinated smear campaign existed, how could he be entirely innocent? For the first time, the jury's eyes shifted with doubt. The boy who was once shielded by innocence now stood at the edge of implication. And then Jasmine Crockett herself stood. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. She let the silence stretch until every head turned toward her. Her eyes locked on the jury, then on Barron before she spoke. "We will call a witness," she declared, each word cutting like steel. "A man who worked inside their operation. He was there when these plans were drafted. He has the original documents." The sentence landed like a thunderclap. The reporters froze mid-keystroke. Jurors stiffened. Even the judge leaned forward. For a heartbeat, the entire room stopped breathing. The idea of a living witness, someone who had been in the room where it happened, sent a chill racing across the chamber. Every camera zoomed in. Every microphone strained to catch the next syllable. Barron's lips parted, but no sound came. His lawyers tried to mask the shock, but it was useless. The press could smell blood. The gallery buzzed with whispers, an insider with proof. Some clutched their phones as if waiting for the next shoe to drop, for the witness to appear, for the truth to finally burst through the cracks. In that moment, the trial's entire dynamic flipped. What had been Barron's offensive was now Jasmine Crockett's siege. She had shifted the weight of suspicion, redirected the spotlight, and promised something bigger, something explosive. And the silence that followed her words was more deafening than any outburst. The room was on edge, waiting for what would come next. The promise of a witness had cracked the air, and when the judge's gavel echoed, the courtroom doors creaked open once more. A hush spread like a wave. Every head turned as a man stepped inside, nervous, pale, yet carrying himself with a strange dignity. His name was David Klein, a former communications aide who had served under both the Trump administration and briefly under the Biden team. His history gave him credibility. His presence gave the trial its most dangerous moment yet. He adjusted his glasses with trembling fingers, but his eyes, though rimmed with fear, were steady. The gallery erupted in whispers. He worked on the inside. He knows. Klein approached the witness stand. Reporters leaned forward, their pens frozen midair. The bailiff swore him in, and for a moment he simply looked at the sheet of paper in his hand, his breathing shallow but controlled. Then Crockett's attorney placed a document before him, a single sheet with bold black letters at the top, strategic public retaliation. The words cut across the room like a blade. Klein gripped the page as though it weighed 1,000 pounds. Cameras zoomed in, catching every bead of sweat on his forehead. Marcia Tillman, Crockett's attorney, spoke with precision. "Mr. Klein, do you recognize this document?" Silence stretched, the kind that pulls every eye into the center of the storm. Klein swallowed hard, his lips trembling, then steadied himself. His voice was low but unshaken. "Yes, I drafted this memo, and Barron Trump signed off on it." The sentence barely lasted 9 seconds, but those 9 seconds detonated like a bomb in the chamber. The stillness that followed was terrifying. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Jurors froze. Reporters stopped typing. Even the judge's hand hung in midair, as though unwilling to break the silence. Then, as if a dam had burst, the courtroom exploded with noise. Gasps, shouts, the rapid-fire clicks of cameras filled the air. The words ricocheted across the chamber, already racing through microphones into the outside world. Barron's face told its own story. A moment earlier, he had been pale stiff in his chair. Now, under the weight of Klein's words, his skin flushed deep red. His jaw clenched, his chest rose and fell as if he had been struck. Every camera turned to him, capturing the collapse of composure in real time. He reached for his lawyer, but his movements were jerky, frantic, exposing the panic behind the mask. Halpern leaned toward him, whispering furiously, but the damage was done. Tillman pounced on the silence. She stepped toward the witness stand, her voice sharp. "Mr. Klein, let's be clear for the record. This memo outlines strategies to deliberately smear Congresswoman Crockett, correct?" Klein nodded, lifting his eyes to the jury. "Yes. It included directives to cut clips of her speeches, emphasize her tone, frame her as unstable, and flood social media with targeted hashtags. It was not speculation. It was an organized campaign." His words landed heavy, undeniable. The jurors shifted in their seats, their expressions darkening. The judge attempted to restore order, banging the gavel, but the uproar wouldn't die. Reporters rushed out, phones pressed to their ears, shouting headlines into the chaos. The news was already spreading across the nation. Barron Trump approved retaliation memo. Online hashtags flipped in seconds, sympathy draining away. What had been framed as a lawsuit for honor now looked like proof of a calculated smear. Halpern tried to counter, rising to his feet. "Your Honor, this is unsubstantiated. The witness's word alone cannot verify such a document." But Tillman struck back instantly, her voice cutting through his protest. "The original file metadata shows Barron Trump's initials, his digital approval. This isn't hearsay, it's direct authorization." The words hung in the air, sharp as nails hammered into a coffin. Klein sat quietly, but his presence loomed large. He had not shouted, not ranted, not dragged on. Just one sentence, 9 seconds enough to tilt the trial on its head. The jurors no longer looked at Barron as the wounded youth. They looked at him as someone complicit, someone who had crossed the line from defense into attack. The transformation was visible, irreversible. And so in that moment, the trial shattered its own frame. It was no longer about whether Crockett had defamed a young man. It was about whether Barron Trump himself had orchestrated a dirty war against her. The memo stood as the smoking gun, Klein as the unlikely executioner of truth. And with that single statement, the ground beneath Barron's defense collapsed, leaving the courtroom in shock and the entire country staring at a scandal too large to contain. The room would never feel the same again. From detonation came judgment, and the room braced for the strike. The judge returned, robe-swaying eyes scanning a gallery wound tight as wire. A final rap of the gavel sliced the whispers, and the hush felt like a vacuum pulling breath from every chest. Lawyers straightened their jackets, pens hovered, and cameras leaned in with predatory stillness. The clerk handed up a sheet, and the judge read with measured cadence that made each syllable land like iron. What began as spectacle now narrowed to a single point, the court's word. "The complaint is dismissed," the judge announced, voice steady, expression unreadable under the lights. "Plaintiff has not met the burden required to establish defamation under applicable law." A ripple rolled through the benches, then stilled as the judge continued. Additionally, the court issues an order for expanded investigation into evidence presented regarding a covert media campaign intended to manipulate public perception. The phrasing was careful, but the meaning was a hammer. The case was over, and something darker would now be probed. The gavel fell again, and the echo traveled like a fault line through the chamber. The reaction crashed in waves, first shock, then noise, then a frenzy that swallowed the aisles. Reporters bolted for the doors, phones already live, chirons practically writing themselves in their frantic whispers. Lawsuit tossed one barked into a microphone, and an expanded investigation ordered into an underground influence operation. The jurors were escorted out, heads low, but their faces betrayed the weight of what they had witnessed. Even the court officers moved, different shoulders squared against a storm they could feel, but not stop. Outside, the news would detonate in real time. Barron Trump did not speak. He stood jaw-locked and let his attorneys form a dark wall that shifted him toward the side exit. A camera tried to cut across the aisle, but he turned away, slipping behind a marble pillar like a shadow breaking off from its source. The boy who had been framed as a victim now wore a different mask, one stitched from silence, bitterness, and a heat that reddened his cheeks. He brushed past a microphone without a glance, a flash catching the tight curl of his hands before he shoved them into his pockets. Not a word, not a nod, only the hard thud of his shoes fading down a service corridor. On the steps, the crowd surged toward Jasmine Crockett as she emerged into the flare of Noonan lenses. Voices called her name, but she didn't raise her arms, didn't soak in the roar. She simply faced the wall of microphones with the same steady gaze that had carried her through the storm. This victory does not belong to me. It belongs to the truth, she said, each word clear enough to cut through static and spin. She thanked the court staff, nodded to her team, and refused to label anyone a monster, even as the headlines crowned her a symbol. The cheers swelled anyway, but she kept her posture plain, almost austere, as if to remind everyone that restraint is also a form of power. The moment felt historic precisely because she refused to make it a celebration. When the crowd thinned and the cameras drifted toward their next meal, the courtroom settled into the kind of quiet that remembers thunder. Barron re-entered through the side door to collect a forgotten binder. Jasmine stepped back in to sign a receipt for exhibits. They saw each other across the empty benches, fluorescent lights, humming dust, hanging like slow snow in the stillness. His stare burned anger, humiliation, a bruise where pride used to sit, and hers met it without flinching, a hard light tempered by the faintest edge of human pity. No words passed because none were necessary. He would not forgive, and she would not retreat. They turned away at the same time, two trajectories fixed by a verdict that changed everything. The silence that followed the verdict did not last. It shattered into arguments that rolled through Washington like aftershocks. On the Hill, committee rooms turned into boxing rings with microphones. Senior members pounded the table about precedent, junior members shouted about accountability, and everyone insisted the republic itself was at stake. Some warned that the courts must remain above politics. Others insisted that the law had already been dragged into the mud. What sounded like legal debate felt like a street fight in suits. The Capitol hummed with the sense that a line had been crossed, even if no one agreed on which line it was. By afternoon, the spectacle spilled into cable studios, podcasts, and town halls broadcast online. One senator called it a textbook perversion of defamation law. Another called it an understandable reaction of a family protecting its own. Legal commentators took their places under bright lights, waving printouts and timelines, replaying the same 9 seconds that flipped the room. A former prosecutor held up the memo like a talisman and said, "This will be taught for years." A civil rights lawyer shook her head. "It's not just about free speech. It's about power deciding who gets to speak." The segment ended, but the argument did not. Across the river, a law school packed an auditorium for an emergency panel. A professor of media law drew a triangle on the whiteboard, law press influence, and traced arrows until the shapes looked like a web. "You want a case study in weaponizing legal tools to chill speech," he said, tapping the marker against the board. "Here it is." A first-year student asked whether anti-SLAPP statutes were strong enough. A clinic director answered that statutes are only as strong as courts willing to enforce them. A visiting scholar added, "The moral stakes are as real as the legal ones. The public isn't reading case books, they're reading faces." Pens scratched. Phones lit the aisles like a runway. Think tanks smelled opportunity and convened breakfast briefings before the coffee finished brewing. A policy memo argued for tightening penalties on strategic lawsuits that target speech around matters of public concern. Another warned against overcorrection that could immunize genuine defamation. A former judge, careful with every syllable, said, "Deterrence without chill is the tightrope." A communications strategist whispered that the real battlefield was not the courtroom, but the feed. The table nodded because everyone knew a legal victory without a narrative is a coin without a second side. The narrative was now running on jet fuel. Bar associations weighed in with statements thick as fog. Some praised the court's restraint. Others urged disciplinary reviews if the memo's provenance checked out. An ethics panel reminded lawyers that zealous advocacy ends where deception begins. Editorial boards called for sunlight subpoenas, sworn testimony document trails tracked like footprints after rain. In every paragraph, the same refrain: "This is bigger than two names on a docket." The fight was about who gets to frame reality and what happens to those who punch back. Out in the country, the split ran through living rooms, barbershops, and break rooms. One crowd said Barron had been dragged into a war he didn't start, a kid caught in the undertow of a father's storms. "He's 19, a caller told a radio host, voice rough with emotion. "When I was 19, I didn't know how to protect myself either." Another group said intent matters, signatures matter, and the memo stamped out the last excuses. A trucker in Nebraska texted into a late-night show, "You sign it, you own it." The phone lines glowed like fused wire. A father in a small-town diner stirred his coffee until the spoon rang the mug like a bell. He told the counterman that sons grow in the shade cast by their fathers, and sometimes that shade turns cold. He said he felt for the boy, but not for the machine around him. At the far booth, a group of retirees argued that sympathy without standards rots the foundation. "If we let the last name carry the blame or wash it away," one of them said, "we've stopped believing in people as individuals." The waitress topped off their cups without asking, because no one wanted to pause the debate. Online, the timeline split like a river around a rock. One stream framed Barron as a casualty of legacy, a teenager burned by the same flame that warmed him. Threads compared him to sons who inherit fortunes and burdens in the same envelope. Another stream cataloged receipts, dates, initials, the language of the memo, and said the line from authorization to action was straight as a highway. "Victimhood," a commentator wrote, "is not a cloak you wear while you swing a sword." The likes stacked high, and so did the counter-arguments. At a VFW hall, the air smelled of varnish and memory. Men with hands calloused by decades of work watched a muted television while a crawl of headlines marched by. One veteran stood and said he admired courage in any uniform, military or civic, and that truth-tellers take incoming fire. Another reminded the room that honor is not a speech, but a habit. "I taught my boy to shake a hand and mean it," he said, tapping the table for rhythm. "If your name signs a thing, your soul signs it too." The room answered with quiet nods. No one had to say more. In a union hall with fluorescent lights that hummed like insects, stewards passed out leaflets about next week's contract vote, but the talk kept looping back to the trial. A welder said he'd seen blame travel downhill his whole life. A foreman said leadership is measured by who takes the hit when things go wrong. The room circled back to the same sentence until it felt like a drumbeat. Consent is not an accident. A retired machinist folded his arms and said it plainer still. "If your plan needs a smear to win, your plan deserves to lose." The hall had heard lines like that before, but tonight they rang louder. In a church basement, a men's group met for the first time since the verdict. They were fathers and grandfathers, business owners and bus drivers, men who had learned to tuck their mistakes behind their ribs and keep moving. The facilitator opened with prayer, then with a question. What does honor require when the cameras are on, and more importantly, when they are off? A gray-bearded contractor spoke about how a single lie in a bid can ruin 3 decades of reputation. A retired banker said integrity used to be the interest on the loan of your name. Heads bowed, not in shame, but in recognition. And then the line that cut through all the noise landed with the weight of a gavel. Men can lose money, lose power, but if you lose honor, your children carry the stain forever. The room went quiet enough to hear the fridge kick on in the kitchen. No one asked who said it first because it didn't matter. The truth of it didn't need a citation. A grandfather leaning on a cane nodded once as if saluting something invisible. A younger man swallowed hard and stared at his hands. The sentence did not accuse. It warned. Wounds heal, but stains linger. Commentators rushed to adopt the line because it translated politics into plain life. A sports broadcaster borrowed it to explain a coach's firing. The losses weren't fatal, the rumors were. A small business owner put it on a chalkboard sign outside his shop next to the day's special. A father texted it to his son without context, then wished he had added a heart. The phrase traveled because it fit in a pocket and because it asked for something old-fashioned and hard. It did not need a hashtag to find a home. It belonged around kitchen tables. Back in the university, scholars tried to put the wildfire into boxes labeled doctrine, precedent, and practice. They drew timelines, traced communications, and compared state anti-SLAPP protections like weather maps. The term case study appeared in deck titles and lecture invites, always followed by the same subtitle on the misuse of law to silence critics. A media ethics professor asked whether platforms have a duty to label coordinated character attacks the way they label ads. A constitutional scholar replied that law can restrain, but culture must remember. The conversation orbited a center of gravity. Process is critical, but character is destiny. One historian reminded a PAX seminar that every era believes it invented the corruption it sees. He said power has always tried to put a price tag on truth, and truth has always resisted the sale. We archive scandals, he said, but what we really preserve are turning points in what a people will tolerate. A graduate student asked whether the verdict would change anything. The historian sighed and said, change is not a verdict, it is a habit. He gestured back to the headline on the projection. That line about honor, he said, is how habits start. Heads nodded because for once a lecture sounded like a life. In living rooms where fathers taught sons to fix leaky faucets and own their mistakes, the drama narrowed to a single principle. Don't weaponize the rules meant to protect your neighbor. Don't hide a knife in a lawsuit and call it civility. If you're wrong, admit it before the mirror forces the confession. If you're tempted to trade integrity for applause, remember who will inherit the echoes. The story had drawn a crowd, but the lesson sat one-on-one in the quiet where men decide what kind of name they want to leave behind. On the airwaves, hosts tried to keep the ratings spike from cooling. Some framed the week as proof that the system still works. Others warned that only sunlight made it work this time. A caller told a late-night program that he didn't care for either side but loved the clarity. You can't pour poison into the well and then cry that the water tastes bad, he said, then hung up without waiting for praise. The host repeated the line twice because it rang. The board lit up with people wanting to agree or to argue, which is how shows stay alive. In offices where decisions about budgets and promotions usually swallowed every minute today's agenda, made space for an unexpected conversation. A CEO told his leadership team that the company's name meant nothing if employees didn't trust it. A plant manager shared that he had once tried to sand down a safety report and still regretted it. A senior partner said clients forgive losses faster than lies. The room did not talk about Barron or Crockett by name. They talked about themselves. Nothing was resolved, but something was recentered. The compass needle found north under a pile of paperwork. Meanwhile, the political machinery kept grinding, because machinery always does. Bills were drafted that would tweak procedures, strengthen early dismissals for suits, meant to chill speech and penalize plaintiffs who weaponize process. Lobbyists sharpened arguments about unintended consequences, reminding lawmakers that bad actors can hide behind free speech just as easily as they can hide behind claims of reputation. The committee calendars filled with hearings that would look like theater and sometimes act like courage. The outcome was uncertain, but the direction felt less so. The line between shield and sword was the point. Church pulpits, bar stools, locker rooms, and factory floors carried the refrain in their own dialects. A preacher said that a good name is chosen rather than great riches. A bartender told a regular to pay his tab and his debts. A coach told his team that the scoreboard lies sometimes, but character does not. A machinist told an apprentice that shortcuts are just long cuts with worse endings. The lesson had crossed out of politics and into Proverbs because it started there, and had only been borrowing the headlines. Through all of it, the image of the courtroom hung in the air like a painting. The memo, the 9 seconds, the face that flushed the sentence that steadied each, became a tile in a mosaic that people would remember in pieces. The verdict dismissed the claim, the order opened a door, and the country stepped through in uneven strides. Some moved with sympathy, some with anger, most with a mixture that made sense only to them. But wherever they went, the thread held. The story's heartbeat was not scandal, but standard. The standard was honor, and honor had a way of asking for an answer. But the shockwaves did not stop at the water's edge. They raced across oceans and seized foreign front pages. In London, editors framed the case as a stress test for American democracy and the independence of its courts. Parisian op-eds probed the line between reputation and repression, warning that lawsuits can masquerade as velvet gags. Berlin anchors replayed the 9 seconds of testimony like a goal replay, studying cadence, posture, and the instant the room turned. What looked domestic became a global referendum on power, speech, and the citizen who dared to speak. Across Europe, debate played out with surgical precision and a taste for theater. A British panel stacked barristers against editors to ask whether defamation should survive the public interest test when officials and dynasties collide. A French nightly program traced the genealogy of political families and asked if legacy is shield trap or both at once. A German weekly diagrammed the memo's verbs frame, amplify, saturate like fingerprints left at a scene. Even in Rome, commentators argued that the real defendant was the idea of accountability itself. Asian newsrooms picked up the thread, but their angles broke the light differently. In Tokyo, a public broadcaster interviewed former prosecutors who said calm delivery can harden testimony like steel. In Seoul media, scholars debated whether coordinated character attacks deserve labels the way paid ads do. In New Delhi, a legal editor translated the memo into street language and asked viewers if they would accept such tactics in their own city hall. From Singapore to Manila, the running question was simple: who guards the lane where citizens speak without being buried by process? Commentators converged on 3 pillars: democracy, free speech, and the raw power of a witness. Democracy, they said, is not just counting votes, it is protecting the road where truth can travel without tolls. Free speech is not the freedom to bruise without consequence, but the freedom to question power without procedural strangulation. And the witness, fragile yet explosive, proved again that courage is a force multiplier. 9 seconds did what months of spin could not, because authenticity compresses meaning into a shockwave. Universities rushed to convert commotion into curriculum. Law schools announced modules on slap strategic lawsuits against public participation, pinning this case to a lineage of process used as punishment. In a crowded lecture hall, a professor chalked process as punishment and circled it 3 times with dusty insistence. Students parsed the memo's directives and matched them against tests for malice, public concern, and early dismissal standards. Clinics built hypotheticals where judges freeze discovery the moment a suit smells like a muzzle. Journalism schools ran parallel drills and autopsies. Verification labs timed the sprint from exhibit to timeline, measuring how fast a document ricochets into national feeds. Editing seminars reconstructed the chopped clips of Crockett frame by frame to restore context amputated for effect. Ethics classes argued whether outlets should apply coordination labels when patterns are visible, but sources remain shielded. One instructor wrote 9 simple words on the board: calm, clear, unblinking, brief, sourced, relevant, limited, necessary, then circled them as a checklist for high-heat testimony. Policy clinics turned the moment into drafts, markups, and mock hearings. Teams modeled penalties for plaintiffs who weaponized process against speech on matters of public interest. Another team drafted safe harbor rules, letting courts pause discovery until an anti-slap motion is heard. Comparative seminars brought guests from Canada and Australia to test portability without blunting remedies for true defamation. Students learned the tightrope deterrence without chill protection, without impunity, speed without sloppiness. Sociologists stepped back to diagram the machine that manufactures outrage. They mapped overlaps between political operatives and media contractors, highlighting handoffs where narratives are baked and shipped. Charts showed algorithms fattening the loudest claims until fringe tactics feel mainstream by repetition alone. A senior theorist warned that when power and media clasp hands too tightly, the handshake becomes a chokehold. The conclusion was blunt partnership can become collusion whenever the audience cannot trace who funds the megaphone. Another sociological thread tracked the human bill for engineered perception. Interviews with school board candidates and union stewards read like dispatches from a quieter front. Jobs lost, marriages, strained friendships, thinned by rumor. Findings warned of a chilling effect that taxes civic life in silence rather than money. The researchers sketched a formula: process pressure plus narrative saturation equals participation collapse. Against that math, the witness's 9 seconds looked less like drama and more like oxygen. Psychology panels put faces to the archetypes. Barron became a lens for dynastic adolescence, a study of expectation outgrowing the person forced to wear it. Clinicians described cognitive dissonance when a signature meant to secure respect becomes the origin of disgrace. They spoke about borrowed identity, a famous last name, acting as armor until it bends into a cage. The larger the inheritance, one therapist said, the smaller the room to turn without scraping the walls. Jasmine Crockett's portrait formed in deliberate contrast, not sainted but seasoned. Psychologists noted resilience markers, purpose orientation, boundary clarity, and the ability to metabolize threat without swallowing it. They acknowledged costs, hypervigilance, fatigue, the isolating static that follows lightning rods. Yet within those costs, they found meaning-making identity anchored in service rather than spectacle. Grit, one clinician concluded, is not noise. It is rhythm sustained when microphones cut out. Public forums translated all that theory back into everyday language. A youth mentor told boys that legacy is a road, not a throne, and you must learn to break before you learn to brag. A civic workshop titled Name Narrative Responsibility asked men to write letters to their future selves about rules they might be tempted to weaponize. A father's circle repeated the line that crossed borders because it fit in a pocket. Men can lose money, lose power, but if you lose honor, your children carry the stain forever. The global aftershock measured in headlines and habits settled into a simple charge: protect the lane where truth can walk without escort. Abroad, editors pressed a harder question that stung because it sounded practical: what safeguards exist when media industries become subcontractors to political ambition? They listed failure points: opaque funding streams, influencer pipelines, and data targeting that turns a smear into ambient fog. They also sketched newsroom firebreaks, source audits that follow money pattern flags, that alert desks to coordinated timing, and clear language that calls a campaign a campaign. A veteran editor put it this way: on air, argue the idea, do not erase the person. Quote the record, do not rent your platform. The ethic was old, but enforcement must be new because velocity outpaced verification. The witness became the quiet hero in these roundups, proof that systems can be pierced by one citizen with steady breath. Segments replayed his entrance: the trembling hands, the steady eyes, the sentence that fit inside a single heartbeat. Analysts noted that authenticity is contagious. Audiences lean in when performance stops, and the truth arrives unadorned. They added that witness protection is not only legal paperwork, but a civic promise that truth-tellers will not be punished for breaking silence. As one anchor signed off, she said courage scales, and viewers repeated the phrase like anthem. Commentators then asked why this particular case traveled so far, and their answers converged on architecture. Strip away flags and accents, they said, and you find a powerful name, a legal tool, a public square, and a single voice. The details were American, but the design was transferable to any capital where status temps process to bend. That universality made the case useful. Journalists could teach from it, legislatures could legislate from it, and citizens could guard against it. The more distant the place, the nearer the relevance, because the plot feels native wherever power meets impatience with dissent. In that mirror, Barron reflected the tragedy of youth operating a machine he did not design but learned to drive. Privileges that once cushioned him sharpened the lessons, not softening them. Every advantage echoed with commands: do not fail, do not falter, do not puncture the myth, until the signature meant to signal strength spoke a different story. Feedback loops punished him in public, and the crowd that once offered sympathy recalibrated toward responsibility. Opposite him, Crockett stood as disciplined endurance, walking through applause as if it were rain, because tomorrow would require spine. By week's end, syllabi city pages and civic groups were harmonizing on a single refrain. Law schools mounted casebooks that stamped this dispute as a living example of slap dynamics, while journalism schools stapled checklists for context, cadence, and coordination. Sociology departments assigned fieldwork on narrative supply chains, teaching students to trace a talking point from war room to WhatsApp. Psychology labs framed reflective prompts around legacy and grit. What part of your name is armor and what part is cage? What part of your purpose survives noise? The world's analysis did not dilute the drama. It translated it so an action scene in one courtroom could become instruction in 1,000 rooms without losing heat. From the global noise and classroom debates, the lasting meaning started to take shape, like a skyline after a storm. The case stopped being a tabloid headline and settled into the country's bones as a warning bell. People understood that what happened in that courtroom could happen anywhere power gets impatient with dissent. They saw how a single lawsuit dressed up as reputation defense could be sharpened into a blade to scare a critic silent. They watched a memo surface and a witness steady his voice, and they realized the real issue was not one person's pride, but the public's right to speak. The lesson was simple but heavy: guard the lane, where truth walks, or one day it will be closed for repairs that never end. Over weeks, the frenzy cooled into reflection, and reflection turned into routines. Editors reworked their checks, asking not just, is this accurate, but who benefits if this spreads like wildfire? Lawyers began each new complaint with a different question. Is this about justice or about leverage? City councils hosted forums on how to protect whistleblowers and still punish lies. Even in quiet towns, people started to feel the weight of process as something that can either protect a neighbor or pin him to the wall. The case rewired instincts, and instincts outlast headlines. You could see the change in how people spoke about power. Before, many shrugged and said that politics is a blood sport and the rest of us are just spectators. After, more citizens admitted that spectatorship is a choice and silence is a position. They began to treat lawsuits not only as verdict machines, but as messages asking what each filing tried to teach the public to fear. They looked past the stage lights and searched for the hand on the dimmer switch. Once you notice the switch, you don't forget where it is. For public servants, the echo was practical. Staffers in state houses traded guides on recognizing slap patterns before the subpoena arrived. Some offices added a simple step: pause, gather counsel, and ask whether the complaint targets speech about public matters. Where the law allowed it, early dismissal motions became a shield, not a stalling tactic. Advocacy groups trained ordinary people to recognize narrative manipulation the way hunters read tracks. The idea was not to win arguments faster, it was to avoid being cornered by them. In homes, the echo was personal. Parents told their kids that truth is not loud but persistent, and that persistence matters when applause fades. Couples discussed what to do if a boss, a landlord, or a council member used paperwork to make a problem disappear. Friends agreed to ask each other hard questions before sharing a clip that felt true. A sentence spread from porch to porch: do not help a machine pretend to be a mirror. Culture shifts when habits change around the smallest decisions. The country also absorbed a deeper warning about alliances between political muscle and media machinery. People learned to spot the seam where coordination begins: the same words in too many mouths, the same angle in too many feeds, the same outrage on a loop. They understood that not all influence is illegal, and not all spin is evil, but a pattern can still choke a conversation without breaking a law. The cure was not to silence partisans. It was to name coordination honestly when it shows up in the room. Naming a thing is the first defense against it. And yet the story also gave a blueprint for courage that did not require costumes. The witness was not a celebrity, not a crusader, just a man who steadied his hands and read a memo into the record. The congresswoman was not a saint in marble. She was a person who chose spine over spectacle even when the cheap route was to gloat. That pairing, one citizen with a document, one leader with restraint, offered a model people can copy without permission. It said the tools for defending truth are within reach: breath, proof, and patience. It said the center can hold when ordinary people hold it. Police chiefs and school boards found use for the lesson too. They adopted clearer rules for handling complaints that smell like intimidation, and they posted those rules in plain language where citizens could read them. Training sessions stopped treating rumor as noise and started treating it as a tactic. The best departments admitted that transparency is slower at first but saves time at the end. They had learned the cost of confusion, chaos in the feed, fear in the room, and trust leaking out like air from a tire. The fix was not dramatic, it was faithful. Churches, unions, and veterans' halls turned the verdict into vows. A preacher said that a good name is chosen rather than great riches, and that a lie buys only a moment. A steward told his hall that a fair fight has rules, and a rigged fight has consequences. A commander reminded his post that honor is not a speech before a parade. It is a ledger you keep when no one is watching. The case made those old lines feel new because they suddenly explained a modern bruise. Principles do not age when they are used. Business owners heard the same bell and changed small things that add up. A CEO pledged not to send demand letters meant only to scare critics who were acting in the public interest. A contractor rewrote his bids to avoid grand claims he could not defend if dragged into the light. A publisher added a line to every deal memo: "We protect speech that checks power even when it makes us uncomfortable." Profit and principle are not enemies when the long game is reputation. It turned out that integrity has a return on investment. The courts, for their part, began to clarify the map so citizens could walk it without a lawyer on each arm. Judges wrote opinions that separated real defamation from the misuse of process to punish speech about public matters. Some states sharpened anti-slap laws, so the first hearing asked the right question: is this case about hiding a critic under paperwork? Others adjusted fees and sanctions so that bad faith suits cost more to file and more to lose. The message was firm, but fair used the courts to seek justice, not to rent force. Law kept its sword, but it shined the shield. All of this added up to a quiet recentering of civic life. People realized that democracy is more than a calendar of elections. It is a culture of permission where truth can move without an escort. They saw that free speech is more than noise. It is the space where accountability is possible and memory can do its work. They understood that the system is not a machine that runs by itself, but a promise that must be kept on purpose, one small act at a time. The case did not save the country. It simply reminded the country what saves it. The reminder stuck because it was earned. The long view then is not abstract. It is a set of actions that ordinary people can take when power gets lazy or loud. Ask who benefits from your anger before you feed it. Demand proof, not just confidence. Support the neighbor who speaks up when the room wants him quiet. Refuse to share a clip designed to inflame rather than inform. And when someone uses paperwork like a club, call it what it is and stand aside for the truth to pass. Courage is contagious, but so is carelessness. In that spirit, the last word belongs to the idea that outlived the scandal. Cases end, careers wobble, and news cycles move on, but standards either rise or sink. This one nudged the needle toward higher ground by reminding people what to prize and what to refuse. It taught that the fastest victory is not always the right one, and that the most polished story is not always the truest. It left fingerprints on how we read, how we argue, and how we decide whose voice deserves room. The sound you hear now is not applause, it is resolve. So the country took the lesson and said it out loud, not as ornament, but as oath. Justice does not always win in the short term, but the truth always leaves a trace. And because a story is only as strong as the people willing to carry it, they added the second line like steel under the bridge. A witness brave enough to tell the truth can change all of history. The echoes of the verdict still clung to the courthouse walls when the message began to crystallize. This was no longer about a clash between a 19-year-old heir and a sharp-tongued congresswoman. It had become a mirror held up to every man in America, especially those with years behind them, and sons, daughters, or grandchildren watching how they carried themselves. The case screamed a truth as old as the Republic, but dressed in new urgency. A name might open doors, but honor is what keeps them open. Men could lose money, lose offices, lose entire fortunes. But if they lost honor, their children would carry that stain longer than any fortune could cover. That was the message humming beneath the gavel's echo. For middle-aged men, the ones who had worked decades, built families, and carried scars, this trial was a sermon in plain clothes. The story said your children may inherit your land, your company, your savings, but what they really inherit is your name. That name can be armor or it can be burden, depending on how you choose to guard it. If you bend rules for advantage, if you hide behind lawsuits to crush critics, if you trade integrity for spectacle, your grandchildren will pay the bill in whispers and in shame. That is the lesson Barron carried out of the courtroom like a scar, and the lesson Crockett delivered with every steady step. It was not theory, it was flesh. Barron Trump sat at the center of privilege, Yet the moment his signature appeared on the memo, sympathy turned into suspicion. The country did not see a boy anymore. It saw a man accountable for his choices. His silence at the end did not protect him. It branded him. Middle-aged men watching could not miss the warning: the world is quick to forgive mistakes made in honesty, but merciless when deception wears the mask of innocence. They saw themselves in him, not in the wealth, not in the headlines, but in the reality that one weak moment can undo years of building. Jasmine Crockett, by contrast, became the living opposite of that stain. She had no dynasty, no gilded name, but she walked with an integrity so sharp it cut through noise. She did not dance on the victory, did not gloat, did not turn her win into a personal coronation. She stood before the cameras and said, "This victory does not belong to me. It belongs to the truth." That single line reached into living rooms like a father's hand on a son's shoulder. It told men dignity is not about shouting louder. It is about standing firm even when the storm tries to knock you flat. For middle-aged men, it was a challenge and an invitation. Choose the kind of legacy that makes your children proud to carry your name. The streets outside the courthouse roared with life. Crowds pressed against barricades, phones high in the air, chanting Crockett's name as if she had just walked out of a championship ring. The sun broke through gray clouds, spilling gold across her shoulders as she descended the steps. The cameras caught her silhouette against that light, turning her into an icon whether she wanted it or not. To her supporters, she was proof that one voice can survive a dynasty's weight. To her critics, she was at least undeniable a fighter who would not bow. But to the nation's fathers and grandfathers, she was something else, a reminder that real power lies not in silencing others, but in refusing to be silenced. Across the plaza, a different scene unfolded in shadows. A black SUV, idled engine, low windows tinted. Inside sat Barron, shoulders, stiff face half hidden in the dim. The roar of the crowd outside barely touched him, muffled through glass and leather. He did not wave, did not step into the light. He stared straight ahead, jaw locked, cheeks flushed not with victory, but with bitterness. In that car, the weight of legacy felt like chains. He had entered court painted as a victim, but left as a participant in something darker. The cameras caught only a fragment of his face, enough to tell the story without words. Youth overtaken by shadow pride, twisted into silence. That split image, the sunlit congresswoman and the boy in the dark car, burned into the public memory like the final scene of a film. It was the closing tableau, one that needed no narration because everyone understood its language. Light and shadow, truth and denial, honor and stain. Men watching from their living rooms, their bar stools, their break rooms saw themselves somewhere in that contrast. They saw the choice laid bare. And they heard the unspoken question: when the crowd chants or condemns when your children carry your name, which image will reflect you? For men past 50 who had seen enough life to know how quickly it can turn, the message landed with special force. They knew the taste of lost opportunities, of words spoken too fast, of deals made without foresight. They knew that wealth and power fade, but reputation follows like a shadow at noon. The trial did not let them off the hook. It reminded them that honor is not nostalgia, it is currency. And the currency is spent daily in contracts, in conversations and decisions about when to stand firm and when to stay quiet. Live so your children can be proud of your honor, not just your name. That line echoed louder than the chants outside the courthouse. Crockett, framed by sunlight, seemed almost to carry that sentence in her posture. She walked without raising her fist, without reveling in conquest. Her calm was itself a verdict, a message that dignity is not noise, but clarity. Reporters shouted questions, supporters raised banners, but she let the moment breathe instead of crowding it with boasts. That choice resonated with men who had learned the hard way that loud victories often age into regrets. The quieter wins, the ones built on truth, tend to last longest. Her image stepping into the light became a story fathers could retell to their sons without editing out the rough parts. Barron's image in the car offered the cautionary counterweight. He was not condemned by a jury, but by a perception he could not control. The dynasty he carried had become too heavy, and the choices he made or allowed to be made in his name turned sympathy into suspicion. Middle-aged men watching saw what it meant to let pride guide the pen. They saw that hiding in silence, hoping shadows will swallow responsibility, only deepens the stain. The SUV pulled away and the cameras followed, but what lingered was not the boy inside. It was the metaphor of a legacy driven into darkness. As the plaza cleared and the news cycle rushed ahead, the story left behind something heavier than outrage or triumph. It left a parable. One figure walked into sunlight because she chose principle over spectacle. One figure sat in darkness because he chose silence over responsibility. For men with children and grandchildren, the parable was plain. You cannot choose your name, but you can choose what it means. And when your time comes to leave a legacy, it is better to leave honor than shadows. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything, like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.